it's hard to talk about sermons. It's hard to write about sermons because each one is individual. It's, even if you have 10 sermons, 15 sermons on St. Benedict, which we do, each one is entirely different. And very often, well, and you know this from today, but very often even the same preacher preaching on the same feast day on the same subject is likely to go in a totally different direction. And we know that in a lot of these sermons by Aelred, by the other Cistercians, they may say, well, today is the Feast of the Purification, and that's what I'm talking about, but then they talk about something totally different.
Holy Queen, Mother of mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To you do we cry, for banished children of Eve. To you do we send up our song.
So it's always hard to know how to group sermons or how to give any kind of real overview of them. On the other hand, of all the things that Elrod wrote, he wrote more sermons than anything else. So he wrote about 198 liturgical sermons. There are a couple exceptions there that I'll talk about. And then he wrote 31 sermons on the prophetic burdens of Isaiah. These sermons, these 31, originated when he gave a sermon on the first day of Advent, first Sunday of Advent, about Isaiah 13 through 15. And his monks, he says, thought they were so good that he would like for him to expand what he did. And he expanded that single sermon into 31 sermons. I'm not at all sure that his monks meant that they would like to have 31 more sermons on that topic, but that's what he says. So in the last years of his life, he wrote 31 sermons on the prophetic burdens of Isaiah, and I'll talk about those another time, but it's worth knowing that this particular group of sermons is outside the nearly 200 liturgical sermons, the sermons he spoke to his monks. The sermons on the prophetic burdens of Isaiah were clearly intended as a commentary, sort of in the way that Bernard's sermons on the Song of Songs were a commentary. Maybe preached, maybe pieces of them preached, but they're put together. There is, after all, no setting in the life of a Cistercian monastery where there's room for a whole lot of different sermons on the Song of Songs. You might get away with one or two of them, but you can't do a whole block of sermons on the Song of Songs. And the same thing is true about the prophetic burdens of Isaiah. You can do one, but you can't really do 31. So this is a literary collection. The nearly 200 sermons, Walter Daniel says that Aelred preached about 200 sermons, but until about 40 years ago, we only knew of about 102. I'm sorry, I can't remember the number right now. And then Gaetano Ricciuti, who has been collecting and editing all of Aelred's sermons, found another huge manuscript full of 98 more sermons. And so that means that we now have about 200 liturgical sermons. Now, not all of those sermons are actually sermons that were preached to his monks. Several of them are designated as sermons for a synod or for abbots. One is a sermon for nuns. One is a sermon for St. Catherine, which we believe was probably preached to a community of women, perhaps on the feast of St. Catherine. So we still have maybe 180, 185 sermons that were probably preached at Rievaulx. Now, first of all, I want to say something about that. We know that the sermons at that point were not preached as part of the liturgy. They were preached in the chapter room. And if you think about the size of Rievaulx, you know that this is not a terribly intimate setting. If you have 140 monks gathered around the chapter room and Aelred preaching to them, then that means it's a large crowd. It's not an intimate crowd. And on the feast days with 2 masses, the lay brothers are expected to be included. So if you imagine 140 monks and 300 lay brothers gathered together to hear Aelred preach, as is often true, this is not the kind of setting we're usually thinking about for a sermon. Further, we know that the order required abbots to preach on certain number of days, the big feast days, the first day of Advent, on Christmas, and the Feast of Peter and Paul. And so that's why we can have, for example, 15 sermons on Benedict, which go all over the place. And Elrod is explicit about that. He says at one point, "You realize full well, my brothers, that it is the custom, according to the statutes of our order, that on this feast, as on a number of others, we should hear something that will edify us." So he's explicit about needing to preach on those days. And in another sermon, he calls attention to the presence of the lay brothers. He says in a sermon on the Ascension, "You who are accustomed to reading the commentaries of the Holy Fathers have no need to hear anything about that. But perhaps the more simple would prefer to hear about something else." So at that point, he abandons both the learned sermon that he might give to the choir monks and the simple sermon that he might give to the lay brothers, and goes in a totally different direction. What I like about Aelred's sermons, and this is not true of all of them certainly, but once again, we hear in his sermons very often the personal voice, the voice in which he is in direct contact with his monks. Father Chrysogonus has said about early monastic sermons, and this applies directly to Aelred, he says, "The preaching took place within a closely knit family of brethren who shared the same ideals and enthusiasms and struggles. Chapter room preaching was accordingly conditioned by the immediate milieu, so that even the loftiest discourse bore the marks of familiarity and intimacy. The special cachet of Cistercian preaching was perhaps encouraged too by the fact that, though based on texts drawn from the liturgy of the day, the preaching took place in the chapter room, with the brethren seated shoulder to shoulder in a kind of circle in which the preacher formed a part." So it's not surprising, then, that Aelred often returns to something about the relationship between the preacher and the listener. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to say that in addition to preaching to the monks in the monastery, he obviously developed a reputation as a preacher, because we know that he was invited to other places to preach. We know that he was invited to his home church of Hexham to preach on a major celebration, a translation of the Saints of Hexham. We know that he went to the Church of Whithorn in Scotland, the Church of St. Ninian, to preach on a festival day of some kind. And 2 of those sermons turned into treatises. In 1163, he was invited to Westminster to preach on the feast of St. Edward for the translation of the relics. So he obviously had a lot of experience and was well thought of. And when speaking in those major occasions, we don't get nearly so much of that personal voice. But when he speaks to his own monks, he's at home and he's talking with people he knows. One of the things he talks about often is the need to prepare properly, what you need to do before you preach. You need to read, you need to meditate, you need to think about it, you need to organize. But he often says to his monks that he really hasn't had time. In fact, that's a running theme, that he didn't have time once again today to prepare. So he says, in a feast on the Assumption, "It is no wonder, dear brothers, if today our prayer does not proceed with the usual sweetness, For as you know, the usual repose did not come before this sermon. Prayer did not enliven it, reading did not strengthen it, and meditation did not adorn it. In order for a sermon to renew the speaker, that's an interesting idea, isn't it, that the sermon should renew the speaker. In order for a sermon to renew the speaker and build up the listener, so two goals, it is necessary for repose to prepare, reading to build up, meditation to strengthen, and prayer to enlighten the mind of the speaker. You perceive then how I am particularly unprepared for this subject today. So here we have the kind of excuse. It's not going to be the kind of sermon that he would really like to give. Another day, he gives another idea about what he's aiming at in a sermon and his concerns. Because many of you grow bored with the same sermon and the same reading, repeated again and again, we need to renew what seems old and familiar, either by adding certain ideas or at least by changing the words. In this way, we can rouse the attentiveness that we seek and call the heart back from its useless and vain digressions to what is useful. So the mind that in its boredom had fled the familiar can, after being renewed by the sweetness of a reading or a sermon, beneficially return to that from which it had been unconsciously distracted. This is a preacher who's honest about what he notices. We were talking about speaking and having people doze off, and how often the preacher may look around the room, especially if you have 300 so people listening to you, and a lot of the old listeners are no longer listening, right? And so for him to address at the beginning of his sermon the awareness that there's a great danger that some of you out there are going to fall asleep, so I have to figure out how to adapt to that. I have to come up with some new ideas, for example, even though he doesn't really have time to do that, and at least change the words in which he puts out the old ideas. Another day he says, we propose a brief subject, lest long-windedness generate weariness in your minds, which are occupied by the joy of the present day. This day is indeed solemn and pleasant, but those who lack both good listening and good deeds celebrate the Sabbath badly. Again, a concern that people are going to doze off during the sermon. Something very, very honest. I almost never hear a preacher say, I know there's a good chance that I may bore you today, but try to stick with it and I'll do what I can. I mean, there's a kind of honesty and directness there that I think is quite wonderful. Another day, he very often in his sermons, I notice, is concerned with the moral understanding. He's very clear that he's trying to teach people how to understand, but also how to behave. And so frequently he focuses on the moral. In fact, there are two sermons I've looked at recently where he copies a great deal, he includes a great deal from another preacher, and the other preacher is moving in the direction of theological understanding. And Aelred turns it around and brings it back to here's what you should do, here's how you should act. And it's very interesting to see him with two sermons which might have gone toward a more allegorical reading, and he pulls it back to do a moral reading. So in this case, this is a sermon on the purification. He speaks directly about his preference for preaching on the moral message of Scripture. And he explains that preference in part as a pragmatic matter, because monks never have very much time, even in chapter. And so it needs time to move along. One of the first monastic churches I was in, Cistercian one, I was struck by up in the upper corner of the church, there was a digital clock blinking green. And I've thought a lot about it over the years, because it's not as though you're going to hurry up with Mass just because the clock is ticking. And I mentioned that not long ago to someone who said that in his first monastery, he was the one who was responsible for making sure that clock was on time. But the awareness that time is ticking on And even in church, you have to be conscious of time, or even in the chapter room, you have to keep time. So he says, granted that both profound allegories and beautiful moral meanings may be found in the text I just read, nevertheless, we think to say something only about the moral reading because of the shortness of time. For the one who speaks ought not to reflect so much on what he feels in himself as on what others may feel in themselves. For a person listens willingly when that which he hears from another he also finds in himself. Most people read mostly Aelred's treatises, and so they don't get this sense of his constant thinking about how to preach and what goes into preaching and what goes into preparing and what is the relationship between the preacher and the audience and the temptation to talk about what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling instead of what you may be thinking and feeling. That real responsibility to reach out to the listeners, to where they are and who they are, and to acknowledge that there's never time to do enough. There's never time ahead of time to prepare, and there's never time while preaching, because at any moment the bell will ring and it will be time to move on to the next moment. Monks have less time in their lives than anybody else I know. Everybody complains about how little time they have, but not everybody else is on the clock the way monks are. And Aelred's sermons reflect that awareness of his own schedule and of the schedule of the people he's speaking to. Because he's concerned with so regularly with the moral reading of the text for the day, he often gives advice about how to follow the moral reading. So a sermon I've just been looking at, it's one of his 13 sermons on the Feast of St. Benedict. He often shows the virtues shown in Benedict's life or in the rule itself as a model for the community. So in this one sermon on the life of Benedict, he speaks about the responsibility of superiors to instruct and strengthen their subordinates by word and example. So again, thinking first of all about what his job is, what he needs to do. And then he goes on to explicate chapter 7 of the rule about humility. And he walks through the steps of humility, explaining them in terms of what the monk is supposed to do. He says, so that we strive to follow Christ through humility. In his rule, he proposed for us 12 steps of humility. There's another sermon where a sermon on the circumcision. He gives several sermons on the circumcision, and several of them are quite brutal. He speaks more about the cutting of the flesh than you would expect to find, or maybe you would expect to find it, but he goes on and on. But in one of these sermons, he begins by saying, this is the hiding place for hedgehogs. Now, this is a very odd way to begin a sermon on the circumcision, right? And he then goes on to say, essentially, I know you're all likely to doze off, so I thought I'd catch your attention here. We're going to be dead. Now, he knows that they know what a sermon on the circumcision is going to be about. And they may not be looking forward to a sermon on the circumcision. So he begins with the hedgehog, and then he goes through the Old Testament and the New Testament and talks about the stone knife and everything, and then ends up by returning to the hedgehog. Now, I don't know. It's very easy to miss the first couple lines of a sermon, and then the preacher says, I hope you were listening there, and you think, oh, wait, what was that? But if anybody was listening from the very first line, then it must have been a treat to come back at the end and find the hedgehogs there again, because it's not at all a predictable sermon. So he's always thinking about changing it up, at trying to bring the listeners along with him. As much as he preferred to work on the moral teaching, and I suppose especially when he had the lay brothers there to give advice for how to live, for given an understanding of how to understand the moral meaning, the practical, pragmatic meaning of the text. He also is repeatedly interested in explaining ideas that I find later in his treatises. And so he will very often give just a few lines explaining, for example, the Augustinian doctrine of the tripartite, the Trinitarian structure of the soul. He doesn't necessarily say that it's Augustine, but he will say, now the soul has three parts. The soul is made up of the reason, of memory, of will or love. And he often does this, will or love, the same thing. And I find then that when I've found those things in the sermons, that when I go to his treatises, I find that he has dramatized those ideas or has developed them more. But he has already been working with them for the monks. So he doesn't have to do the entire developed theory. But what he can do is to start playing with the ideas and make sure that people have heard just a piece of it. I've recently been looking at his real interest in the way the relationship between blindness and the healing of the blind and purity. That is that, in classical literature, the blind man is understood to be a seer. There's something about being blindness that gives special insight. For Aelred, and you can think of St. Paul, although he doesn't so much in this regard, for Aelred, blindness is a sign of impurity, and when the blindness is healed, when someone heals the blind, that may be a sign of regained purity. And over and over and over, this comes up in his sermons. So it's very interesting to me that as he works with moral ideas, he also is trying to work out for the benefit of the listeners in short form these larger ideas that he wants to play with elsewhere. As I say, he wrote 14, gave at least 14, 15 sermons on St. Benedict. And I think some of these sermons are the most powerful and the most useful. And so I thought I would talk just a little bit today about these sermons. And in these sermons, the sermons of Benedict, he tells us about Benedict, and he proposes Benedict as a new Moses who leads us out of the desert, who leads us out of Egypt through the desert into the new Israel. So we have Benedict as our model. But he also talks, and this is a place where you might very well expect this, he talks a great deal about community. And it's in his sermons on Benedict that I think he comes closest to exploring the meaning of Cistercian community. So, in one of his sermons, this is sermon 8 on Benedict, he says, "You, my brothers, are the tabernacle of God. You are the temple of God, a temple because the Lord will reign forever in you. Yet still a tabernacle because he is on pilgrimage in you. He hungers in you. He thirsts in you. For each one of us has his unique gift from God, one this, but another that. One person can make an offering of more work, another more vigils, another more fasting, another more prayer, and another more lectio or meditation. For all these offerings, let one tabernacle be made, so that as our legislator commands, no one shall say or presume that anything is his own, but all things are common to all." So he begins by explaining that God travels in the tabernacle that is composed of the brothers themselves with their different gifts, with their different abilities. So not that God stands outside looking on, but that he is carried within the movements, the gifts of the brothers. And then he goes on and says, "No one should boast on his own about any grace given by God as if it were exclusively his own. No one should envy his brother because of some grace, as if it were exclusively his. Whatever he has, he should consider the property of all his brothers. And whatever his brother has, he should never doubt is also his. Or that Almighty God can immediately bring to perfection anyone he pleases and bestow all the virtues on any one person. But in his caring way of dealing with us, he causes each person to need the other and to have in the other what one does not possess in himself. Thus humility is preserved, charity increased, and unity is recognized. Therefore each belongs to all, and all belong to each. Thus each has the benefit of the virtues while preserving humility by the consciousness of individual weakness. So God travels, he says, in the tabernacle that is constructed by the brothers as they live together, sharing both strengths and weaknesses, virtues. And God could give anybody all the virtues if he wanted to. Why doesn't he make everyone equally strong, equally kind, everyone generous, equally humble? He could, but no, this way each one brings something separate and puts it together, and within that, God travels. And the weaknesses that members of the community share are also parts of the boards and nails that make the tabernacle. There's a 13th, 14th century English play about Noah's Ark, in which the men say, okay, I'll get busy and I'll do this. And the women, the wives, say, okay, I will bring the wood from the woods. And someone else says, and I will cut it. And they say things like, because I'm just a woman and I can't do much, so I will bring the logs from the wood. And my students always read this as suggesting that, in fact, the playwright doesn't think the women can do much. But what's clear is that the women say, I'm weak, I can't do it, I will bring a heavy log. There's something about this idea of weakness as bringing its own strength to what is being constructed. And Aelred suggests that about Benedict's understanding of the tabernacle in which God travels. My favorite passage, I think, aside from the one about going into the rich field, which is Isaac, is when he says in a sermon, and I think this is one that wasn't preached, it's in De Oneribus. He says to his monks, "It is time to take a journey that the order's law demands of us, to which desire rouses us and affection invites us. But how will I be separated for such a long time from my heart's desire? I will be separated, I say, in the body, but not in the spirit. And I know that I will be as present in affection and spirit as I am absent in body. But think, beloved, of what was written of the Lord Jesus just when his physical presence was about to be taken from his disciples. Eating with them, he ordered them not to leave Jerusalem. We have already gotten up from the table after our sweet banquet, and a little while we will depart. Following his example, we command you, we beseech you, we remind you not to leave Jerusalem, for Jerusalem means peace. We commend peace to you, we command peace among you. May Christ himself, who is our peace, making both into one, keep you in the unity of spirit and the bond of peace. I commit you to his protection and consolation under the wings of the Holy Spirit. May he restore you to me and me to you in peace and safety."